When people think about the Titanic disaster, they usually focus on the collision, the sinking, the lifeboats, and the survivors, but there is another chapter of the story that receives far less attention. A chapter that began only after Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic. By dawn, the world's most famous ship no longer existed above the surface. Yet thousands of personal belongings remained floating across the ocean. Pieces of wreckage drifted for miles, and somewhere within that vast debris field were the victims. For families waiting ashore, one question quickly became overwhelming. Could their loved ones be found? Could they be identified? Could they be brought home? The answers would lead to one of the largest and most emotionally difficult recovery missions in maritime history. A mission involving undertakers, embalmers, sailors, clergy, and grieving families. A mission that revealed the immense human cost of the disaster. Today, we examine what happened to the bodies after Titanic sank, how recovery crews searched the Atlantic, why many victims were never found, and why the tragedy continued long after the ship disappeared beneath the waves. At approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, Titanic vanished beneath the Atlantic. The immediate disaster was over, but a new reality emerged. The ocean surface became a vast field of debris, furniture, wood, personal possessions, life belts, fragments of the ship, and the victims. The conditions were unlike anything most recovery crews had ever encountered. The disaster site lay hundreds of miles from major ports. Weather could change rapidly, and ocean currents constantly altered the location of debris. Every passing hour complicated recovery efforts. Yet almost immediately, plans began forming. The dead could not simply be abandoned, or at least, that was the hope. One vessel would become forever associated with Titanic's recovery operation, the cable ship CS Mackay-Bennett, based in Halifax. The ship received an extraordinary assignment: locate and recover victims from the disaster area. Preparations began immediately. The mission required supplies unlike those carried on ordinary voyages: coffins, embalming materials, ice, clergy, morticians, medical personnel, and recovery equipment. Even before departure, crews understood they were embarking on a voyage unlike any other. They were sailing not to rescue the living but to search for the dead. Days after the sinking, recovery vessels reached the disaster area. The scene was deeply unsettling. Debris stretched across portions of the ocean. Evidence of catastrophe remained everywhere. Recovery crews moved carefully through the area, watching, searching, and recording. Then came the discoveries: one victim, then another, and then another. The scale of the tragedy became impossible to ignore. Each recovery represented a human being, a passenger, a crew member, someone with a name, a family, and a story. The statistics reported in newspapers suddenly became personal. Finding victims was only the beginning. Identification presented another challenge. Recovery teams examined clothing, jewelry, documents, tickets, letters, and personal effects, and anything capable of revealing identity. Detailed records were maintained, and descriptions were written carefully, and possessions catalogued meticulously. The process reflected a profound concern because families deserved answers, and every identification provided one small measure of certainty amid overwhelming loss. Some victims carried clear evidence of identity, but others did not. As a result, not every recovered individual could be named. The Atlantic had obscured many stories forever. One of the most difficult aspects of the recovery mission involved logistics. Space aboard recovery vessels was limited. Resources were limited and time was limited. The number of victims exceeded expectations. Soon crews faced heartbreaking decisions. Not every recovered victim could be transported ashore. Certain bodies were embalmed and preserved for return, while others were committed to the sea. The criteria reflected social realities of the era: identification status, condition, available resources, and perceived ability to return remains to families. These decisions remain controversial. Yet the crews faced circumstances few people could imagine. There were no ideal solutions, only difficult choices. Many Titanic victims received burials at sea. Religious ceremonies were conducted and prayers were offered. The dead were committed to the ocean. For some families, the knowledge proved devastating: no grave to visit, no burial plot, and no physical location for mourning. Only the Atlantic itself. Yet for recovery crews, burial at sea often represented necessity rather than preference. Conditions aboard ship created practical constraints and preservation technology was limited. The disaster scale overwhelmed available resources. The ocean that had claimed the victims also became their final resting place. No city became more closely associated with Titanic's dead than Halifax. Recovered victims brought ashore arrived in a community suddenly tasked with confronting unimaginable grief. Morgues expanded operations, churches organized services, volunteers assisted families, and officials coordinated identifications. The city became a center of mourning for the entire disaster. Funerals occurred repeatedly and newspaper coverage intensified. The human cost became visible not as numbers but as individual lives. Among the most famous recovery stories involves an unidentified child. Recovery crews found the body of a young boy. Despite extensive efforts, identification proved impossible at the time. The child became a symbol of Titanic's innocent victims. The funeral drew extraordinary attention. Many who attended had no personal connection to the child, yet they felt compelled to honor him. Decades later, advances in forensic science would eventually help identify the boy, but for generations, he represented the countless stories left unfinished by the disaster. While recovery operations unfolded at sea, families waited ashore. Waiting became its own form of suffering. Some hoped loved ones had survived while others feared the worst. Information arrived slowly and conflicting reports circulated. Recovery lists appeared in newspapers and names emerged gradually. Each announcement changed lives as some families received confirmation, while others received uncertainty, and uncertainty often proved more painful than certainty. Despite extensive recovery efforts, most Titanic victims were never recovered. Ocean currents dispersed remains across enormous distances. Weather-altered conditions and time worked against searchers. The North Atlantic is vast beyond comprehension. Even modern technology would struggle with such a challenge. As a result, hundreds of families never received remains. No funeral, no grave, and no final goodbye. Only absence. The missing became one of the disaster's most enduring legacies. One of the most common questions concerns the wreck itself. What happened to those who went down with the ship? The answer involves complex oceanographic processes. Titanic rests at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet, and conditions at that depth are extreme. Pressure is immense. The environment differs dramatically from the surface world. Marine organisms, chemistry, currents, and time all play roles in shaping what remains. Researchers approach this subject carefully and respectfully. What matters historically is that the wreck site represents a memorial as much as an archaeological location. It is a place connected to hundreds of lives lost during the disaster. Titanic's recovery crews rarely receive the attention given to passengers and survivors, yet their experiences were extraordinary. They worked under difficult conditions and they confronted tragedy directly. They performed emotionally exhausting tasks day after day. Many recorded their impressions in journals and reports. Their accounts reveal professionalism, compassion, and determination. The recovery mission represented an act of service during one of history's darkest maritime moments. Today, some Titanic victims rest in cemeteries, particularly in and around Halifax. These sites attract visitors from around the world: historians, researchers, descendants, and travelers. These are people seeking connection with the human stories behind the disaster. The graves remind visitors that Titanic was not merely a shipwreck, that it was a human tragedy involving individual lives and individual losses, and that every stone represents a story interrupted. Perhaps the most important lesson concerns perspective. History often reduces disasters to numbers, casualties, survival rates, and statistics, but recovery operations reveal something different. Every victim had relationships, dreams, responsibilities, ambitions, and families. The recovery mission transformed abstract numbers into human beings, and in doing so, it preserved an essential truth. The Titanic disaster was ultimately about people, not merely a ship. What happened to the bodies after Titanic sank? Some were recovered, some were identified, some were returned to families, and some were buried at sea. Many were never found. The recovery mission became one of the largest and most emotionally difficult operations of its kind. It revealed not only the scale of the disaster, but the compassion of those determined to bring dignity to its victims. More than a century later, Titanic remains one of history's most studied tragedies. Yet behind every investigation, every documentary, every photograph of the wreck lies a simple reality. The disaster involved people. Real people, and the story of what happened after the sinking is ultimately a story about humanity's attempt to honor them. The Atlantic took Titanic in 1912, but the memory of those who were lost continues to endure. In cemeteries, archives, family histories, and in the quiet waters where one of history's greatest tragedies unfolded. If you are enjoying this deep dive and want more captivating, thoroughly researched videos like this, consider subscribing. I post in-depth documentaries that separate evidence from speculation and explore stories you won't hear in a typical news report. The series continues, and our next video will feature the title, The Real Villain of Titanic.